The story takes place during World War II, specifically in May 1944, where a Japanese trader named Saito is being transported along with other prisoners back to his homeland, where they will be forced into slave labor. Saito is in solitary confinement until two guards appear to take him to the ship's commander. In the cabin, the officer looks at him with disdain and says that betraying his own country is unforgivable, adding that not even the death penalty would be a sufficient punishment for him. Then, more soldiers arrive, bringing a British prisoner named Bronson, who shows deep hatred for the Japanese. The commander then reveals his plan for the two, stating that they will be chained together for the rest of their lives. The soldiers approach and handcuff the two by their feet. Bronson tries to resist, making his contempt for the enemies clear, but he is ultimately overpowered, and the two are chained together, with no chance of choice. When they think that this will be their fate, to everyone's surprise, an enemy attack begins against the Japanese ship, and the prisoners start a rebellion. Bronson and Saito seize the opportunity to attempt an escape and engage in combat with the soldiers. A submarine approaches the ship and soon fires a missile in its direction. In the cabin, now with only the officer and the two prisoners remaining, the man draws a gun to execute them, but in a swift movement, Bronson grabs Saito and they both leap into the open sea before the explosion hits them. A few hours later, Bronson manages to swim carrying Saito to a nearby deserted island, and upon reaching solid ground, he faints from extreme exhaustion. The next day, Saito wakes up thinking it was all a nightmare, but when he looks at his own leg and realizes he is still chained to the British soldier, reality hits hard. He tries to wake Bronson, but the man remains unconscious. Nearby, Saito finds the corpse of a soldier who was also washed ashore, and he crawls over to try and take his weapon. When he starts to contemplate shooting, Bronson suddenly awakens and attacks him. The two engage in a violent struggle. As they fight at the water's edge, something sinister approaches through the waves. Bronson strikes Saito and tries to force him into the sea to drown him. Saito's leg, injured during the fight, begins to bleed, attracting an unknown creature that soon grabs Bronson and pulls him violently away. The man begins to be attacked by something with sharp claws and quick movements. Saito, seizing the moment, picks up the weapon and aims at Bronson, but decides to shoot the creature, which immediately recoils and disappears into the waters. Bronson is injured, and now that both realize there is something much worse on the island than the hatred between them, they decide to call a truce to try to survive. A little away from the beach, Bronson asks what that thing was, but since they speak different languages, Saito seems to not comprehend the words, although his expressions make it clear that he knows exactly what he saw. Saito spends some time in silence, reflecting, and attempts to commit suicide, but Bronson quickly stops him and asks if he has gone mad. He then takes the only remaining bullet from the gun and hands it to Saito, asking them to ally and use that last chance against the creature pursuing them. The two end up finding some supplies that have been washed ashore, and Bronson finds a pack of cigarettes, offering one to Saito, who declines with a lost and hopeless look. While Bronson continues rummaging for something useful, he ends up discovering the body of a young man, one of his companions, and cries, saying he was just a boy with a whole life ahead of him, which wouldn't have been interrupted if Saito's country hadn't started that war. Saito, even without understanding a word of what was said, feels the pain of losing someone and offers him some water. Bronson accepts, and together they gather some more items as they prepare for the night. When darkness falls, they improvise a camp, and Bronson tries to put on his boot, but due to the chains, he can't and feels pain. Saito then remembers that he earlier took larger boots from a dead comrade and offers one to Bronson, who refuses to wear anything related to Japan. Saito prepares some crabs and offers them to his new companion, who accepts as he has been without food for days, but struggles to hold the food and ends up dropping it in the sand. Saito, seeing this, hands over his own crab to Bronson, who initially declines, but the Japanese insists and leaves the food next to him. Bronson tries it and enjoys the food, and the two start to feel more comfortable with each other's presence. Then Bronson decides to introduce himself formally, and Saito manages to understand and even pronounce his name, then stating he is called Saito. Bronson asks what they will do about the chains, but Saito remains silent. Later, Bronson constructs an improvised tool to try to cut the links. He tries but fails, until Saito points to one of the ends of the chain that is weaker, near his own foot, and says something in Japanese. Bronson does not understand but sees the gesture and wonders if he should try. Saito then encourages him, and with 2 strikes, the chain loosens, leaving both excited. Now it's Bronson's turn, and Saito asks for the tool, which makes the Brit a little nervous, but he decides to trust. When Saito prepares to act, Bronson says he will look away, and Saito laughs at the situation before freeing Bronson with a single blow. Bronson celebrates, relieved that he didn't lose his foot, and the two celebrate out loud, but the noise attracts the attention of something watching them in the darkness. Saito realizes that something is nearby, and both become alert, but the being quickly disappears. They arm themselves and go in search of clues, and Saito finds tracks in the sand, starting a brief investigation, but they are interrupted by a voice that catches his attention, and when they turn, they see it is a Japanese soldier. As they approach, they realize there are two soldiers, and they have a prisoner. Bronson begins to suspect that Saito will betray him, but the Japanese hands over his machete as a sign of loyalty and asks Bronson to hide. Saito remains in place and notices the food is boiling when one of the soldiers smells it and decides to investigate, finding someone seemingly sleeping at the camp. Saito reveals himself and asks them not to shoot, while Bronson watches the scene from afar. The soldiers do not know that Saito was considered a traitor and decide to trust him, while Bronson, distracted, does not realize that the threat is right behind him. At the camp, Saito speaks with one of his former comrades and asks if anyone else survived. The man replies that only they escaped because they wore life vests while the others drowned. Bronson, in turn, realizes too late that the sea monster is behind him, and not knowing what to do, he closes his eyes, but when he opens them again, he sees that the abomination has already vanished. The man begins to observe the place and asks if there truly is no one else on the island. Saito responds that he is alone, but the soldiers are already suspicious and notice other signs of Bronson's presence, escalating the tension. One of them stands up wielding a katana and begins to recount that before the shipwreck, there was a rumor about a traitor and an enemy who were chained together. Then he removes the cloth covering Saito's foot. The soldier comments that usually, in such cases, the accused try to kill themselves, but that in this one, it was different. The other questions where the fugitive is. Saito asserts that he is dead and points to a grave where they buried Bronson's young friend. The Japanese says that aside from being a traitor, Saito is also a liar and threatens to cut his throat with the katana if he does not reveal the whereabouts of the man. Before he can do anything, a roar echoes across the island and everyone stops, while the other prisoner panics, saying it is the tribe of fishmen. He kneels and begins to pray. One of the soldiers orders the youngest to check what that noise was, and he ends up approaching Bronson, who steps on a dry twig and makes noise. This catches the soldier's attention, who heads in his direction, but the creature's growl makes the soldier change course, alleviating Bronson for a moment. The Japanese continues his patrol until reaching the entrance of a cave, enters, and goes deeper, not noticing that the monster was camouflaged among the entrance stones. Meanwhile, Bronson seizes the chance to try to rescue his friend. Inside the cave, the creature reveals itself behind the soldier, who turns quickly and tries to stab it with the tip of the weapon, but the monster brutally tears off his arm. The man's scream echoes across the island, and the other soldier, thinking it is Saito's fault, prepares to kill him, but Bronson strikes him with a fatal blow. He prepares to finish off the enemy with a shot when the creature appears and hurls the soldier's head at them, letting out a terrifying scream. The duo runs to hide as the fishman approaches the injured enemy and kills him completely. The prisoner, desperate, tries to flee. The creature leaps onto him and brutally eliminates him while Bronson and Saito, watching from a distance, decide to leave. The monster soon notices the two and begins a chase. The men run through the bush, and Saito clears a path with his machete. Bronson says he has a plan and asks Saito to wait, but he doesn't understand his language and keeps advancing. Bronson stumbles and falls behind, and the fishman quickly catches up to him. Desperate, he fires but misses, wasting his last bullet. The creature grabs him by the neck and raises its claws to kill him, but Saito returns and attacks the monster, forcing it to release Bronson. The two take the opportunity to flee, but they slip down a slope and roll downhill, injuring themselves severely until they lose consciousness. The next day, both are very injured. When they wake up, Saito notices he has a branch stuck in his chest. In great pain, he gets up and pulls the branch out with effort. Meanwhile, Bronson is lying on a piece of rotting wood, suspended at the edge of a waterfall. As he tries to move, the log sways dangerously, and despite trying to maintain his balance, he slips, hits a rock below, and falls into the water. Submerged, he has memories of the first attack, and, with difficulty, manages to swim to shore. Saito, in turn, finds the katana of the dead soldier. The two are now separated and continue walking upstream, until at the top of the waterfall, the fishman lets out a scream that echoes throughout the forest, which is heard by both of them. They become alert, and Saito, who was crouched drinking some water from the river, decides to stop and go look for his friend. Bronson continues climbing alone until he encounters an obstacle, a large waterfall blocking his path, and he decides to climb it. Night begins to fall, and the two are still separated. Saito seems to be managing to leave the river area, but has not yet found Bronson. Meanwhile, Bronson crosses the waterfall and decides to stop and rest for a moment, but soon hears noises nearby. Saito, still lost in the forest, also hears the sounds and becomes alert. Bronson finally exits the deeper part of the river, sits at the edge to rest, and soon feels a presence beside him. When he turns to look, he comes face to face with a huge crocodile beside him. With no options, he remains still. The animal merely observes and soon returns to the water. Bronson, still in shock, rises and resumes his walk. He arrives near the top of the waterfall, but soon slips and, at that moment, sees the creature, which now appears to be applying something to the wound Saito had caused earlier. Bronson realizes that the creature is much smarter than they imagined and tries to get out of there to warn his friend, but ends up making noise and has to crouch down to avoid being seen. As he watches from his hiding spot, the fishman goes to the river's edge when it is brutally attacked and dragged away by the same crocodile as before. The water quickly fills with blood, and the crocodile floats on the surface for a few seconds, until the creature resurfaces and splits the animal in half, leaving Bronson completely terrified. The monster then lets out another terrifying scream, which Saito hears from the other side, making Bronson flee immediately. Saito continues walking through the forest, searching for his friend, when he comes across something strange. He approaches and finds a corpse tied to a tree, which frightens him and causes him to fall into a hole. Inside the hole, Saito discovers the head of another fishman. He observes the scene for a few moments and now knows that the creature can be killed. With renewed hope, he decides to leave there and search for something useful on the body. He finds a firearm in the hand of the dead man, and upon seeing bullet casings scattered on the ground, deduces that it was he who killed that other being. Then, Saito picks up the gun. Now armed with his katana and a pistol with ammunition, he decides to go after the creature. On the way, he finds the wreckage of a plane and decides to enter the water to reach it. Upon entering the partially submerged plane, Saito spots something inside. Meanwhile, Bronson also finds a part of the fuselage that has fallen and soon arrives at the same plane in the water. Before investigating, he uses pieces of the scrap metal to improvise a spear. Then he enters the plane and finds some items like a flare gun, a lighter, cigarettes, and other objects. But something catches his attention. When he tries to reach for the item, he slips and sees something stuck in the plane's wing. He goes to check it out and discovers a bomb, which gives him an idea. Soon after, Bronson takes a break and lights a cigarette. While smoking, he starts to hear footsteps approaching and, when he turns, sees it is Saito. Bronson asks why he is shivering and offers him a cigarette. Saito declines and says he needs to show him something urgently. Bronson doesn't understand, so Saito uses his lighter to try to explain. Two go together to a cave, and upon arriving, Saito points to something strange. They discover that the creature is incubating an egg. Bronson slowly approaches, and Saito warns him that that creature is female and extremely territorial. Bronson doesn't want to leave without killing it, but Saito says that if they do, it will only incite the fishman's fury. Yet Bronson says it's them or her. The man asserts he has an idea and asks Saito to follow him, while the creature realizes Saito has taken the weapon of the man she killed earlier. Back with the soldiers, Bronson shows the bomb he found and asks Saito for help carrying it to the monster's lair, and with much effort, the duo manages to transport it. At the location, they find that the trigger is bent, and Bronson desperately tries to fix it, while Saito tries to alert him to the danger of staying there. Meanwhile, we see that the creature is returning to the nest. Bronson says that there is an emergency axe in the plane, which might work, and that they need someone to stay there to activate it. Saito, with a sad face, tells his friend that because of him, they were sent to this place and offers to stay, but they are soon interrupted by the creature's growl. The two decide to go outside, and Bronson activates the flare to see in the dark. While Saito stands guard, Bronson tries to grab the axe, but the axe is stuck in the plane's metal, and Bronson struggles to pull it out. Soon the monster appears in front of Saito, and he immediately prepares for combat. The two engage in fierce combat, but the fishman defends himself skillfully, and finally, Bronson manages to rip the axe from the plane. Saito goes into hand-to-hand combat with the creature and manages to kick it closer to the plane, giving Bronson a chance to hit it with the axe several times. The two engage in a brief fight against the beast, managing to corner it for a moment. But when they look at the sky, they notice the flare is fading, and when they look back ahead, the creature has already vanished. The duo then quickly returns to the cave to finish the job, and Saito again stands guard while Bronson tries to fix the bomb's latch. When Bronson finally manages to do so, the monster appears behind him and attacks, but Saito quickly reacts and stabs the monster in the chest. When preparing to cut off its head, the monster throws him against the wall and goes back to attacking Bronson, managing to injure his chest. Saito, seeing this, gathers his strength, gets up, grabs his weapon, and shoots the creature in the eye. It releases Bronson, and Saito shoots again, but misses, so he decides to change his target and shoots the monster's egg, causing it to explode and the hatchling to fall to the ground, which makes the fishman rush toward him. As the creature sees that its hatchling is dead, Saito runs to try to help his friend, but he is severely injured. Bronson hands his belongings to Saito and tells him to go. While the creature holds its hatchling, Saito in great pain leaves his friend and exits the cave, and soon the monster approaches Bronson, who quickly activates the bomb. Bronson counts down, and when he gets to 3, the bomb doesn't work. Then he remembers his friend's words about how he easily cut the chain, so he puts into practice Saito's teachings. The bomb is activated, and a large explosion occurs as Saito watches from outside the cave. Saito, saddened, moves away from the area, but again hears that terrifying growl and realizes the creature survived. He begins to run through the bushes, and the creature chases him through the forest. Saito runs to the beach and kneels hopelessly, but remembers his friend's sacrifice and, fueled by fury, decides to fight. Soon the creature arrives on the beach and sees someone kneeling in front of it and charges, only to discover it fell into a trap. Saito rises from the sand and begins a confrontation with the monster. He strikes the creature, but is also injured in the process. The soldier does not give up and faces the abomination head-on. He commands the monster to advance, but Saito manages to dodge it and delivers some strikes, even cutting the creature's abdomen, causing it to fall to the ground. He moves closer to the weakened being and, looking down at it, readies his katana, but instead of finishing it, he drives the blade into the ground beside it and steps back to grab a flare. Hearing more sounds coming from the forest, he begins to walk toward the beach. There, he tries to activate the flare, but it is broken, shattering his last hopes. Exhausted, he collapses in the sand and ends up passing out, while the smoke from the explosion at the camp would prove useful later on. Hours later, Saito is aboard an American ship, being interrogated by an officer accompanied by a Japanese translator. The man asks if Bronson helped him, but Saito remains silent. Then the officer orders the translator to question what his crime was. Saito responds that he killed his commander because he could no longer bear to see his comrades dying for senseless orders. The officer then goes back to speaking about Bronson, and Saito begins to remember the good times he spent with him, revealing that the two became friends. The officer asks if anyone is still alive on the island, and Saito replies that no one remains. He then looks out the ship's window as they pull away from the shore, and we discover that there are still several creatures alive out there.